Hi there, welcome to Explain This, a podcast where we try to explain complex things in simpler ways for people of all ages. I'm your host Jin Kim, and today we'll learn about one of the greatest life-saving interventions in the history of medicine, antibiotics. Let's get started. Infectious diseases have been the number one killer of human beings since the dawn of time. It's hard to read a history textbook without at some point coming across, and a third of Europe were wiped out by the Black Death. Or, malaria has killed 50 to 60 billion people throughout history. Plagues and poxes, and even simple wound infections, have been killing everyone from the elderly to babies to new mothers to previously healthy police officers, and it's only very recently that we have had effective countermeasures against them. Heck, it's been less than 200 years since Louis Pasteur developed the modern germ theory, and we understood that infections were caused by microorganisms, rather than bad smells called miasma. And yet, nowadays, people don't really think about infections being a nuisance, like cold and boils, rather than the potentially deadly diseases that they are. Of course, we have scares like COVID-19, Ebola, anthrax, and meningococcus popping up once in a while to give us a reality check. But the regular Joe and Jane don't think about the fact that around 700,000 people die from just influenza every year. This is probably all thanks to modern medicine finally turning the tables on microbes in the last 100 years, giving us the ability to dethrone infections from the top cause of death, making ways for things like heart attacks, strokes, and smoking-related lung disease to be the top causes of death in developed countries. We can thank infection control measures like hand hygiene and disinfectants and systems such as quarantine, but one of the most useful tools we have against infections is drugs. So, today, we are going to dive deep into the world of antibiotics, the magic bullet that can kill bacteria while not harming human cells. But first, let's explain how antibiotics work to you as if you're a child. We've talked about how your body is kind of like a castle made out of pancakes. At least, that's what you look like to germs. These germs, such as bacteria, want to get past your castle defenses and tucker into your scrumdiddlyumptious, nutritious cells. Your body has some amazing defenses, such as the inflammation alarm system, fever that can turn the heat way up to cook the germs, soldiers that search and destroy called white cells, and even automatic homing missiles called antibodies. But germs have been around for millions, if not billions of years. They're way older than we are, so they've learned to trick your body and evade the defenses in various ways. This is why your even just your great-grandparents lived in terror of dying from an infection, where the germs win and eat up your delicious pancake body. That is, until just about 100 years ago, scientists finally created a magic bullet that can specifically kill the invading bacteria, giving our body a chance to fight back and win the war. You see, bacteria, a specific type of microbes that cause a lot of sickness, like nasty skin owies and bad infections that make you cough until you die, are kind of designed like a tank. They have really tough armor on the outside that can protect them from all kinds of things, like other cells attacking it. Some of them have special armor coated in slime that are immune to the body's defense system, or makes your body not even able to see them. Well, some clever scientists figured out that there are certain chemicals that only affect the bacteria's armor, but not our cells. What these chemicals do is they stick to the things inside the bacteria that are constantly building the armor. Because the armor is actually like chainmail, made up of lots of teeny tiny blocks that are linked together to make a super tough wall. So if the chemicals attack the things that are linking up the blocks, handcuffing them so they can't work anymore, the bacteria won't be able to build more armor. This means that the armor breaks down quite quickly without the proper maintenance, and the bacteria becomes naked. Out of embarrassment, the bacteria burst like a bubble, and hooray! You've killed the tough bacteria. These special chemicals are called antibiotics. And thanks to antibiotics, you won't die from having a small cut on your hand, or because some rude person coughed in your face. Gross. Scientists have been working really hard in the last 100 years to develop more and more different kinds of antibiotics too, because some bacteria have very different armor, like how ninjas don't need chainmail or tough steel armor. So instead, we can attack different parts of their machinery, like we can stop them from making proteins, so they grind to a halt, or we can cut up their DNA, so they don't have any instructions to follow. How cool is that? But you can't let your guard down, because bacteria aren't stupid. They've already caught on to our secret weapon and have come up with lots of their own defenses, like magic scissors that cut up the antibiotics before they can work on the bacteria. And that's the reason you need to take all of the antibiotics the doctor gave you, even if you're already feeling better. Because if you don't, little Timmy, you're going to give the bacteria a chance to study the secret weapon, and they'll become superbugs that are immune to the antibiotics, and they will kill us all. Welcome back. Okay, so antibiotics are totally a geek out topic for me, because I think they're one of the coolest inventions in human history. The fact that I'm an emergency doctor who relies on the effectiveness of antibiotics to treat my patients kind of plays into it as well. And before you get worried, rest assured, I'm not going to bore you with the super deep medical details like minimum bactericidal concentration and how third-generation cephalosporins have better blood-brain barrier penetration. Which means you will miss out on some cool details of how gentamicin is like a nuclear bomb and vancomycin is like scheduled air raids, but you'll just have to hit me up for more details on the floor if you want that kind of juicy goss. Anyway, let's go right back to the basics. What are antibiotics even? We have to go over a technically here. Strictly speaking, the word antibiotics come from antibiosis. Anti meaning against, biosis meaning way of life. So, is a bullet an antibiotic? Well, as the Delight XKCD comic states, when you see a claim that a common drug or vitamin kills cancer cells in a petri dish, keep in mind, so does a handgun. But no, antibiotics specifically refer to a group of chemicals that stop the growth of microorganisms. The original definition went as far as only including naturally secreted substances such as penicillin, rather than chemically synthesized drugs such as the sulfur drugs. Weird place to get pedantic about how organic your drugs are, but sure, whatever. Thankfully, nowadays we use the term antibiotic more broadly to describe drugs, both natural and artificially synthesized, that can kill bacteria. This is because, as we'll talk about, microorganisms include a variety of very different life forms such as bacteria, fungi, viruses, and parasites, whose main common theme just happens to be that they are tiny. So technically, the broader term would be antimicrobial agent if you wanted to include all of the medications that can kill these other organisms, or antibacterial agent if you're just talking about bacteria. To make things really easy for you, when we talk about antibiotics today, we're specifically just talking about bacteria. Even though technically there's some crossover with antifungals, but whatever, just think about bacteria. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about how antibiotics came to be. Like I said, infectious diseases have ravaged humanity, along with most other living organisms, since the dawn of time. Which is why we've already done so many infection-related episodes on Explain This, such as fever, episode 10, vaccines, episode 24, sepsis, episode 56 just a few months ago, and bacteriophages, episode 18, because apparently even bacteria suffer from infectious diseases. But considering how long we've suffered under the tyranny of microorganisms, we haven't had many tools to fight them. There have been various folk remedies of varying effectiveness, but without knowing that infections were caused by microbes, we didn't stand a chance. All we could do was use rudimentary quarantine and personal protective equipment, like the type that the infamous beak doctors used during the Black Plague, and burn the victims' dead bodies so that the infection wouldn't spread to the living. But when germ theory became widely accepted in the 1860s, people fervently researched how we might be able to combat microbes to treat infections. But it took almost 50 years before the first antibiotic was to come around. So we have to go back to 1909 and meet Paul Ehrlich, a German microbiologist and chemist who had a dream. Ehrlich proposed the concept of a Zauberkugel, which sounds like a hearty German bread, but translates roughly to the magic bullet. He thought there must be a type of chemical that will kill bacteria while not killing human cells. Because what's the point of injecting bleach into your veins to kill all of the bacteria if it's going to kill you as well? Thankfully, Ehrlich was already working with chemicals that did something very similar: stains. These are chemical dyes that stain certain types of cells without staining others, so you can see the specific bacteria you're studying under a microscope. So, Ehrlich, with the help of a Japanese microbiologist named Sahachiro Hata, set out to find a type of stain that would not just tag and color bacteria, but harm or even kill it dead. And after 606 attempts, the pair finally found an arsenic compound that was effective at killing bacteria that caused syphilis, Treponema pallidum. And then they gave a super badass name fitting of the first antibiotic in history, Compound 606. Yeah, I guess German practicality. 606 was later sold with a hotter name, Salvarsan, and it inspired another German team led by Gerhard Domark to create the first sulfur antibiotic, Prontosil, in 1932. Both Salvarsan and Prontosil were miracles in that they were the first effective drugs to kill bacterial infections. But they also had many downsides, such as not really working against many types of bacteria, or being inactivated in pus. But still, we finally had something that could fight against bacteria reliably. But if you know anything about the history of antibiotics, you're not thinking of arsenic and sulfur-based antibiotics, right? You're thinking of the one true legend of antibiotics, the moldy champion. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, give it up for penicillin. Unless you've lived under a rock, you've probably at least heard of penicillin. You might even know of the heroic story of a lone scientist combining good fortune and dogged determination to single-handedly discover one of the most important medicines ever discovered. Because history loves to tell stories of the solo hero, disregarding the complexities and numerous people involved in such paradigm-shifting events. No. Today, we're going to talk about the real story behind penicillin. But this time, we're going all the way back to 1928, which, if you've been paying attention, is actually between the Salvarsan and Prontosil being invented and released on the market times. We find ourselves in St. Mary's Hospital in London, where a Scottish microbiologist named Alexander Fleming was working on the influenza virus. Fleming decided to go on a holiday to take a break from his work, but oopsie-daisy, he left the lids open on his petri dishes where he was growing some bacteria. And stop me if you've heard this story, he comes back from his holiday, discovers that there's gross blue mold growing on his petri dishes like an unattended orange, but what's this? The Staphylococcus bacteria that he was growing on the petri dishes are all cowering on the edge of the petri dish, avoiding the blue mold. Maybe because they're gross? Or maybe because the fungi responsible for the mold was producing a chemical that was somehow repelling or killing the bacteria. Fleming worked tirelessly on this fungi, penicillium, and was able to successfully extract the magic chemical, penicillin, with the magic property of stopping bacterial growth right in its tracks. A powerful antibiotic, throwing a wrench into staph bacteria's way of life. And the rest is history. Or is it? Turns out, as amazing Fleming's discovery of penicillin was, it really didn't catch on initially. His initial research paper didn't see the spotlight, which meant that Fleming never got enough funds or interest to continue working on the potentially powerful new discovery of penicillin as an antibiotic, and he was actually more interested in using it for microbiology purposes. No, the real heroes of the penicillin story came a whole 11 years later. Enter Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, whose team at Oxford rediscovered Fleming's paper, thought there was potential here to uncover a powerful weapon in the war against germs, and got a research grant to continue Fleming's work. They were able to replicate Fleming's methods to extract some penicillin from the quote-unquote mold juice. And that's right, if the alternative medicine crowd come at you for taking antibiotics saying it's unnatural, you tell them just how grossly natural penicillin is. As a side note, there are plenty of examples throughout the world of ancient cultures using various molds as treatment for infections, from China to Australia to Egypt to India. But no one had successfully distilled it into a useful medicine until Fleming, Florey, and Chain, who would later, spoiler alert, get a Nobel Prize for their work. Anyway, with the extracted penicillin, Florey and Chain experimented on some unfortunate mice who came down with a scientist-injected bacteria into my bloodstream-itis. It's a mouthful. They then treated half of the mice with penicillin, while the other half were left to the magical healing powers of nature. And what do you know, the next day all the mice that received penicillin survived, while the rest died. With this promising initial result, the group was confident that they were onto a powerful antibiotic. The next step was testing it in humans to check that it was safe. There were various helpful people who volunteered to have penicillin to show its clinical safety, but the real case that brought penicillin to the limelight was a 43-year-old police officer named Albert Alexander, who had the misfortune of nicking his face while shaving. Soon after that, he developed a nasty facial infection and sepsis, a serious life-threatening condition where the immune system is overreacting to the infection and killing you in the process. That's right, it wasn't long ago that you could die from an infection of even the tiniest cut. Luckily for Albert, the Oxford team had extracted enough penicillin to trial treating him with the new antibiotic. And presto, Albert magically started feeling better from the next day, and his infection looked like it was shriveling up like tears in a pizza oven. Unlucky for Albert, though, the team quickly ran out of penicillin because it was so hard to extract from the penicillium fungi that he relapsed into infection and died. Yeah, medical history is not always happy-dappy. Then again, most of history isn't. Anyway, poor Albert's case highlighted just how useful penicillin and antibiotics in general could be a game-changer in modern medicine. So now the race was on to figure out how to mass-produce penicillin. The obvious direction was to look for a strain of the penicillium fungus that could produce a higher yield of penicillin. So people started feverishly hunting down all the different penicillium molds around the world. And finally, in 1943, a US team made a breakthrough when they came across a moldy cantaloupe in a fruit market out of all places. And they were able to isolate the Penicillium chrysogenum fungus, which seemed to produce a significantly higher yield than any other strain. It was just leaking penicillin to wazoo. And to celebrate this remarkable discovery, the team ate the cantaloupe. Ugh. This is why we need to pay scientists more, people. They apparently cut out all the moldy parts, but the general recommendation in food science is please don't eat food that has gone moldy, even if you've cut out the icky parts. Anyway, thanks to this discovery of the magic cantaloupe penicillium and some X-ray induced mutation, we finally had the ability to mass produce penicillin and fight infections on a large scale. See? The real story is always so much more interesting than the watered-down surface-level stories you hear. Alright, so you get it. Antibiotics are super awesome, and they've revolutionized medicine. But why and how? How do antibiotics like penicillin actually work to kill bacteria? Let's take a short break, and then it's time to get real small and meet a bacterium. Welcome back. And thank you for coming back even after sitting through a brief history lecture on drug development. We now move on to the enemy. No, not the Dark Lord Sauron, but bacteria. Bacteria are one of the oldest life forms on Earth. They are what are called prokaryotes, which means primitive nucleus, because they're so boomer that they don't even have a nuclear membrane. Which sounds like a burn calling them old, but we've been getting our butts whooped by these geezers for most of our history, so who's really being burned here? Anyway, bacteria are surprisingly simple, yet incredibly efficient. Think of them like a bullet. Inside the bullet, bacteria contain their DNA, which is the genetic instruction manual code, and ribosomes, which are teeny tiny protein factories that can read the DNA and go, I understand these 4 letters, and print out proteins like a 3D printer. What else is in there? Oh, not much else? Yeah, bacteria cells are much simpler than our cells, which are eukaryotic, with complex nuclear design and things like Golgi apparatus and the mitochondria, aka the powerhouse of the cell. So let's look at the bullet's casing. The bullet, or the bacteria, is wrapped in a thin membrane that keeps everything in like a sausage casing. Covering this layer, or the cell membrane, is the cell wall, which is a more rigid and tough outer shell that not only helps the bacteria keep its sexy body shape, but also protects it from outside invaders and harm. This is the armor we need to break down to kill bacteria. But even worse, there's another layer called the capsule, which is kind of like a force field that protects the cell wall. So there's actually multiple layers of defense in such a teeny tiny, simple being. Many bacteria also have tiny hairs on the outside, and the flagellum, which acts like a rotor to let it zip around. But that's pretty much it. They really are more of a bullet than a nuclear warhead or a smart missile. And just like bullets, its strength comes in numbers, because all bacteria want to do is eat and multiply. Like any cell, bacteria can grow and then split in half to double their numbers. So as long as they have ample food, like if they're living in a giant pancake castle that is your body, they can breed freely and flood the area like popcorn popping in a cinema. Okay, so now you know what a bacterium looks like. Whoopee! I'll include a picture in the show notes so you can visualize it. But why, Jin? Why are you subjecting us to learning about how a bacteria looks? It's not like we're going to stab at it with teeny tiny needles. Well, like Sun Tzu said, if you know your enemy and know yourself, then you won't lose in 100 battles. Knowing how bacteria look and function is crucial in understanding antibiotics, because we're trying to throw either a wrench in the gears of the bacteria factory, or making it literally burst like a bubble. Although there are dozens of antibiotics, which thankfully you won't have to learn all of them unless you're a poor medical student trying to pass your exams or the regular ward round grilling by mean consultants like Jin, we can divide them into 5 types, based on what they do to the bacteria. There are 3 groups that affect what the bacteria do, and 2 that affect how the bacteria keep its shape. First, we can go right to the source and destroy the DNA. Antibiotics like rifampicin, quinolones, and nitrofurantoin. Don't worry, you don't have to remember these names. I'll let you know when the important ones come up. These ones will bind to different enzymes in the bacteria that help maintain the DNA integrity, causing the DNA to fall apart, killing the bacteria from the inside. Second, we can prevent those ribosomes from printing out proteins using the DNA. Lots of antibiotics do this, such as gentamicin and the aminoglycosides, doxycycline and the tetracyclines, macrolides like erythromycin, and chloramphenicol. These drugs can bind directly to parts of the ribosome to stop them reading DNA. Well, technically the messenger RNA. This makes them confused, so they either don't produce any proteins or print really wonky and weird proteins. And because proteins are the building blocks of life, no proteins, no life. Oh, one more cool thing about these antibiotics that affect ribosomes. Turns out, prokaryotes like bacteria have different sized ribosomes compared to eukaryotes like humans. So because their ribosomes are slightly smaller in size and technically a different type, these antibiotics affect bacterial ribosomes but do jack all to human ribosomes. So it's kind of cool, really. Anyway, let's move on. Third, we can halt the bacteria's metabolism or general cell function. The sulfur drugs like sulfonamide and trimethoprim do this by stopping the bacteria from making a vitamin called folic acid, which they need to make DNA and proteins. You know how pregnant women have to take iodine and folic acid? That's because growing babies need that extra folic acid for all the cells they're building. Yummy yum yum. So if you stop a bacteria from making folic acid, they can't just nip to the pharmacy to buy some pregnancy vitamins. So they can't do anything and kind of just sit there, stunned. Alright, so many ways we can mess with a bacteria's functioning. But what if we want to be extra brutal and just tear them apart instead, like Lisa? There are 2 main ways we can do this. One way is to attack the cell membrane, that thin sausage wrapping that keeps all of the bacteria's insides, well, inside. Drugs like amphotericin B, nystatin, and the azoles, which are actually antifungals, do just this. They make the cell membrane all leaky, so the cell kind of oozes out like a slug in salt and dies. But an even more effective way to kill bacteria is messing with the tough outer cell wall. This is how penicillin works. I know, right? Finally. The cell wall is mostly made up of blocks called peptidoglycan, or PG. These blocks are chained together in a neat grid, forming a super tough chainmail-like mesh. This is why bacteria are so tough and resistant to damage. So if we can somehow disrupt the links between the PG blocks, the cell wall will fail, and our immune system army can triumph and attack the squishy center. We have lots of drugs that can do this. For example, vancomycin is a super chunky molecule that can bind to peptidoglycan and act like a giant boulder wedged in a brick wall, stopping other peptidoglycan blocks from linking up and punching a huge hole in the cell wall. But no. You're here because you want to know how the most commonly prescribed group of antibiotics, the penicillin family, work on the cell wall. So without further ado, let's introduce you to one of the most important chemical structures in pharmacology, the beta-lactam ring. Beta-lactam ring totally sounds like a D&D magic item or some science fiction weapon, right? That's because it kind of is. If you look at the molecular structure of penicillin, you notice what looks like a square in the middle of it. The square, made up of 3 carbon atoms, a nitrogen atom, and an oxygen atom hanging off one corner, is what's known as the beta-lactam ring. It looks innocuous and simple, but this is what gives penicillin its superpower. You see, when it comes to the bacterial cell wall and peptidoglycan chains, someone has to build it and put it all together. And in bacteria, that someone is a group of proteins called penicillin-binding proteins. Wow, how amazing that the bacteria happen to have something called penicillin-binding proteins. It's like penicillin was the prophesized one that will save us all. Oh, nope. Obviously, the protein was named after penicillin was discovered. Duh. Anyway, as the name suggests, these proteins get bound real good by penicillin. Imagine if you were diligently doing your job of laying one block after another, linking it up, thinking about your lunch break, when all of a sudden, BAM! Mysterious alien facehugger that has the exact shape of your mouth and throat attack and gag you, just like in the Alien movie. That's kind of how beta-lactams do. They're shaped in the exact configuration to bind to the penicillin-binding protein's active parts, making them useless and unable to work. Like those necklaces that look like a heart cleaved in two, and they fit exactly like a puzzle pieces? Aww. Well, not all for the bacteria, because with no one building the cell wall starts to crumble and disintegrate, and the bacteria is left defenseless. Many bacteria just burst and can't maintain their shape, whereas others are easily attacked and killed by the immune system that was waiting for the antibiotic artillery support before charging in and mopping up the weakened bacteria. The cool thing is that once we discovered that the beta-lactam ring was the active part of penicillin, chemists could do all sorts of fancy things to improve penicillin. The OG penicillin had a lot of weaknesses, like it wasn't well absorbed in the stomach, and you had to take it at an hour before food and 2 hours after food to make sure your stomach was really empty. And considering that you need to take it 4 times a day, if you do the maths, you suddenly have to have your meals in a ridiculously scheduled way. So chemists figured out ways to change the penicillin molecular structure without disrupting that central beta-lactam ring. This created even better versions of penicillin, such as ampicillin and amoxicillin, that could be eaten with food, more effective against various bacteria, and so on. Yep, knowledge is indeed power. Beta-lactams are incredibly important because they're also used in various other classes of antibiotics. If you heard of the cephalosporins such as cefazolin, cefuroxime, and ceftriaxone, these are all beta-lactams as well. The super antibiotics meropenem and imipenem, one of our most powerful antibiotics, also rely on beta-lactams to kill bacteria. But unlucky for us, bacteria have also figured this out. Well, not consciously, just through natural selection. Many bacteria secrete a special enzyme called beta-lactamase. In biochemistry, if you hear something ase, like lipase or proteinase, it means that the enzyme cuts up that something. So beta-lactamase can snip-snap up beta-lactam rings into confetti, making them useless. This is a form of antibiotic resistance, which we'll talk more about later in the episode. But we're even cleverer than bacteria. Since discovering that bacteria can do this, scientists further improved penicillin to be less degradable by beta-lactams. We've also discovered a cool chemical called clavulanic acid. This sneaky fella happens to bind really well to beta-lactamase, in the same way that beta-lactams bind to penicillin-binding protein. So, it muzzles the beta-lactamase and keeps it busy, while the penicillin can charge forth and do the job. This awesome buddy cop movie is the story of how the antibiotic augmentin, or amoxiclav, works, where you have a combination of amoxicillin and clavulanic acid in one tablet to fight against bacteria that produce beta-lactamase. So yeah, science rocks and the arms race between us and bacteria rage on, as we'll talk about when we discuss antibiotic resistance. But before we get there, we need to address a very important question. If penicillin is so awesome and we have these cool new versions like amoxicillin, flucloxacillin, and augmentin, and even the cephalosporins, why do we need all these other antibiotics like gentamicin and erythromycin? Why do we torture medical and nursing students with all of these different antibiotics instead of having the one true antibiotic that can kill all bacteria? And this is where the topic of antibiotic choice comes in. So, the problem is penicillin is amazing, and we do have ways of making it better and better. But unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to antibiotics. It's kind of like how it's almost impossible to find a cure for all cancers. There's too many different types of cancers that all act and respond differently to treatments. In the case of antibiotics and infectious diseases, the problem is that there are so many different types of bacteria, and they can be quite different from each other. One of the biggest weaknesses of penicillin is that it's good against what are called gram-positive bacteria, but not against gram-negative bacteria. Essentially, you can split bacteria into these two major groups thanks to a quirk in their anatomy. Remember how when we talked about the anatomy of a bacteria, I said that they have a thick, super strong armor called the cell wall? Well, turns out that some bacteria have thick cell walls, but some other bacteria have really thin cell walls, and instead deploy another way of defending themselves. That's right, it's our old friend lipopolysaccharides or endotoxins from episode 56 on sepsis. Gram-negative bacteria still have a cell wall, but it's super thin. Instead of using this as their main defense, they have a layer of toxic chemicals built into their outermost capsule. Instead of thick metal armor, think of this as a booby trap. If you touch it wrong, then it'll explode and cover you in shrapnel that bursts into flames. Anyway, what this means is that if you throw penicillin at a gram-negative bacteria, you run into two problems. First, the penicillin has a hard time even getting to the cell wall, because they have a hard time getting through the outer membrane that shields the cell wall. Even if they manage to penetrate the barrier and reach the cell wall, the gram-negative bacteria aren't relying that heavily on the cell wall, so destroying it doesn't do enough damage to slow them down. This is why we need different kinds of antibiotics. If you have appendicitis, a kidney infection, or atypical pneumonia, these infections are typically caused by gram-negative bacteria, which means penicillins and cephalosporins don't work as well at killing the germs. You might weaken them enough that your immune system can do the rest and stave off the infection, but if you're really sick and the immune system is already struggling, you're better off at attacking the infection from a different angle. For example, gentamicin, an aminoglycoside antibiotic that meddles with the bacteria's ribosomes to stop the protein production, is very effective against gram-negative bacteria. So, we use it in people with severe urinary or kidney infections. A quick note on gram-positive and negative. The term comes not from how cheerful or grumpy the bacteria are. It goes all the way back to the days where scientists such as Ehrlich were figuring out what kind of chemical dyes or stains affect certain bacteria versus others. The gram stain method is a series of steps where you stain the bacteria with something called crystal violet, which sounds like a soft drink flavor, wash it out with iodine and ethanol, then counterstain it with another stain called safranin. Sounds a lot like a cocktail recipe, doesn't it? What happens is that gram-positive bacteria, where the cell wall is thick and plump and full of peptidoglycan, the first stain, the crystal violet, gets trapped in the cell, leaving the bacteria purple like the minions from Despicable Me 2. On the other hand, gram-negative bacteria have very thin cell walls, so the crystal violet gets washed away by the ethanol in that second step. This means that the second stain, safranin, seeps in and dyes the bacteria a lovely pinkish red color. And like we said, it's super important knowing if a bacteria is gram-positive or negative, because it's a very quick way to figure out which antibiotics we should be using in a patient suffering from a severe infection. There are many more ways we can figure out what type of bacteria we're dealing with, and what's the best antibiotics to use on them. For example, you can look at the shape of the bacteria. Bacteria typically come in three major shapes: circles, rectangles, and spirals. You have circular bacteria like Staphylococcus and Streptococcus, rod-shaped rectangular bacilli like E. coli and Salmonella, and spiral bacteria like Treponema, which causes syphilis. You can also look at how they arrange themselves. If you see a bunch of round bacteria, or cocci, they could be staph or strep, both very common bacteria that cause skin and lung infections. But if they're bunched together like grapes, then you know it's Staphylococcus, which is Greek for bunch of grapes. Funnily, coccus comes from the Greek word for berry, which makes Staphylococcus sound like a nice bowl of fruit, instead of the nasty antibiotic-resistant killer it is. On the other hand, if the round bacteria are in a chain like they're doing a conga dance, that's Streptococcus, which means a chain of berries. You dig? You can go even deeper. Like, if you see that the round bacteria all dancing around in pairs, squished together like hamburger buns, they'll most likely be Streptococcus pneumoniae or Neisseria, such as Neisseria meningitis, that causes the deadly type of bacterial meningitis that you've heard of on the news. But how do you tell these two apart if they look so similar? Both of them can cause meningitis, and one responds really well to penicillin, whereas the other needs a more special antibiotic like vancomycin. This is where you can be clever and combine the different ways to categorize bacteria. So, if you do a gram stain, the paired diplococci bacteria will light up as purple or red. If it's purple, that's gram-positive, making it much more likely to be streptococcus. If it's red, that's gram-negative, which makes it likely to be Neisseria. So just by seeing if a bacteria is gram-positive or negative, and what shape it is, combined with knowing what the most common bugs of those types are, we can make a good educated guess at what bacteria is responsible for the infection, and how we can best make it pay. With enough time, the hard-working laboratory technicians and microbiologists can figure out exactly which species and subspecies we're dealing with. Even better, they can expose them to various antibiotics in a petri dish and figure out which antibiotics actually work against it. It's the difference of blindly throwing your poor Rattata at a haunter, not knowing that normal type moves don't affect ghost types, versus having a guidebook and crushing all of the gym leaders with your excellent knowledge of type effectiveness and stab moves. And if you have absolutely no idea what I'm talking about, you really need to go play a Pokemon game. I've just finished playing Pokemon Team Rocket Edition this week, and it was excellent. Anyway, it's only been 150, 160 years since germ theory was developed, and we already have the technology to identify different types of bacteria, letting us select the specific kind of weapon to kill it best. Isn't that cool? But annoyingly for doctors, that's not the only thing to consider when choosing the right antibiotic. Some antibiotics work better for some areas of the body. Like, most medications can't enter the brain tissue to treat infections, so you need special ones that can, like ceftriaxone. Sometimes, whether you give it in a tablet form or as an injection makes a difference, because of how the drug is absorbed and metabolized. So if someone's very unwell, we tend to give them intravenous antibiotics to bypass the gut. But if someone has the poops from Clostridium difficile or C. diff, then we give them a tablet form of vancomycin. This is because it doesn't get absorbed well in the gut, and it makes itself all the way to the colon, where the bacteria are living, like a Trojan horse delivery. We also have to remember that antibiotics, like any medication, are not entirely harmless. Firstly, allergies to various antibiotics is surprisingly common. So you don't want to give someone penicillin if they're known to get anaphylaxis or a deadly allergic reaction to it. Some antibiotics, like cephalosporins and penicillin, are similar enough with that beta-lactam ring that some people will react to both, while others won't. If you have kidney or liver problems, then you might not be able to get rid of the antibiotics from the body after they've done the job, so you can overdose on them. For example, the antibiotic gentamicin is powerful at killing gram-negative bacteria, but it can also damage your kidneys and make you go deaf, so we have to be careful and check the patient's kidney functions before loading them up on it. If you're pregnant, some antibiotics are harmful to the fetus, such as trimethoprim causing spina bifida because it interferes with the folic acid, or doxycycline causing teeth and bone abnormalities. And lastly, we have to consider if we even give any antibiotics to the patient in the first place. Like I said, antibiotics aren't completely harmless. Even if you're healthy with no allergies, antibiotics very commonly cause nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, because they kill all the good bacteria in your gut that help regulate your digestion. And if you have an infection from a virus or fungus, then antibiotics will have zero effect on them because they're not bacteria, the thing antibiotics are designed to kill. It'll be like telling you to spray weed poison around your house because you have rats. It just doesn't make sense, and you'll just be puking and pooping violently for no good reason. Most importantly, if we give you antibiotics irresponsibly, then we risk creating our worst nightmare, superbugs, or antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You might have heard about superbugs becoming an increasing problem in recent years, almost as if it was an up-and-coming apocalypse scenario, or the next Black Death. In some ways, it kind of is, and unfortunately, as with many potential apocalyptic scenarios, we're the cause. I've already mentioned the example of beta-lactamase producing bacteria as a good example of how bacteria can develop resistance to antibiotics. This can happen because bacteria secrete an enzyme or chemical that nullifies the antibiotic, or the bacteria itself might change how its body works. For example, in some bacteria, the penicillin-binding protein has a slightly altered shape, so beta-lactam can't bind to it and muzzle it. It just bounces off. It almost feels like the bacteria are conspiring against us, experimenting with various nefarious ways to defeat our newest weapons in an evil secret lab. But actually, it's just evolution in action. Let's say, hypothetically, that an antibiotic can wipe out 99% of bacteria in one day. This sounds like a lot, but in the case of most infections, you're dealing with millions of bacteria. So even if you wipe out 99%, if you start with 1 million bacteria, 10,000 bacteria remain. This means that if you take antibiotics for 1 day and stop, and if these bacteria can divide and double every 2 hours, in 24 hours there'd actually be 1.2 million bacteria. But it's not just that they grow back. The 1% that survived the first wave of antibiotics were either lucky and didn't get hit, or they had some feature that helped their survival rate just slightly. It could be that their cell walls were ever so slightly misshapen, or that their poop diluted the antibiotics, or something like that. So after 24 hours of multiplying, the entire new colony of bacteria have this ability because they reproduce by cloning themselves, meaning that the antibiotics will be less effective in the second round. If you wipe out another 99% of these bacteria, then again, only the most fit to survive will remain and repopulate. If you repeat the cycle over and over again in billions of people over generations, you end up with some bacteria that have perfected the art of fighting against antibiotics. Not because of careful planning, but because of the power of natural selection, and us not finishing the job. You know, that old philosophy from Machiavelli's The Prince, where he says that if you come for the king, you best not miss. That's basically what's happening with antibiotics. Because we live in an era where we can fight infections with antibiotics, both doctors and regular people get complacent and start overusing and misusing antibiotics. This includes taking antibiotics when it wouldn't do anything for the illness, such as sore throats, colds, and gastroenteritis caused by viruses, or just taking it because I feel unwell. But even worse is that people are really bad at taking medications. My God. Antibiotics are usually prescribed in a specific way, so that the blood level of the medicine is constantly above a certain rate. This is effectively carpet bombing the bacteria over and over again so they never get a chance to repopulate, until there's virtually none left and the immune system can mop up the rest. But what frequently happens is that many people don't like taking antibiotics or any medications, so they'll stop taking it as soon as they feel better or just miss several doses, even if the course that they've been prescribed hasn't finished. This takes us back to the situation where only the fittest of the bacteria survive. Over time, more and more bacteria strains survive this way, becoming more and more resistant to the antibiotics we have available. Two great examples are Staphylococcus aureus and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Staph aureus used to be super susceptible to penicillin. It's the first bacteria observed to be killed by the penicillium mold by Alexander Fleming. But within 50 years, a vast majority of staph were immune to penicillin. We developed better versions of penicillin, such as methicillin and flucloxacillin, that could fight against staph's defense systems. But then with time and ongoing antibiotic misuse, Staph aureus developed even more defense mechanisms, even overcoming these special antibiotics designed to fight them. This is what we call methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA for short. Luckily for us, we had a secret weapon up our sleeves, vancomycin, the aforementioned chonky boy. But then, within a few decades, scientists discovered another strain of Staph aureus known as VRSA, vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. Ah, shoot. We've seen the same problem with tuberculosis. The first anti-TB antibiotic was produced by a wonderful scientist named Salman Waxman in 1943. Before then, millions and millions of people died of the so-called consumption, withering away over years while infecting their family and friends. But with antibiotics such as streptomycin, rifampicin, and isoniazid, we finally had a way to combat the White Death, a disease that has plagued us since antiquity. But you know where we're going with this, don't you? Scientists found TB bacteria that had resistance to these antibiotics since 1943, the year they started being used clinically. Nowadays, multi-drug resistant tuberculosis accounts for at least 4% of all new TB cases, and the numbers are just rising. There are even extensively drug-resistant, or XDR TB, causing chaos. And because tuberculosis disproportionately affects countries with low income and resources, the fact that the older, cheaper, widely available antibiotics don't work on these TB strains makes it even harder to treat the patients, resulting in more unnecessary deaths. There are still cocktail antibiotic regimens involving 3 or 4 different medications given over months to years to treat MDR and XDR TB, but it's really hard. So yeah, we're seeing more and more that the readily available antibiotics we have are becoming less and less effective against bacteria. Could it be that the era of antibiotics will only be a flash in medical history, lasting less than 200 years before bacteria are fully immune to them? It sounds sensational, but it's a real possibility. And it all starts with you not taking your damn antibiotics to completion, or taking antibiotics when you don't need to. There are some exciting new technologies such as nanotechnology, bacteriophages, and better antibiotics being developed, but bacteria evolve so much faster thanks to their super short life cycles, so it's an uphill battle for us. So if you want to help doctors and scientists out and cancel the superbug apocalypse, don't ask for antibiotics that your doctor doesn't want to prescribe you, and if you do need to take it, make sure you finish the whole course, unless you want to get reinfected by an even nastier, clingier, more resistant bacteria. So, what did we learn today? We learned that infectious diseases have plagued humanity for thousands of years, with no good treatment available until the last 100 or so years. We learned that antibiotics are a type of medication that can kill or slow bacteria, to treat infection and give our immune system a chance to fight back better. We learned about the history of antibiotics and penicillin, and how scientific progress doesn't usually come from one person's genius, but the hard work and collective effort of multiple people over time. We learned about what bacteria are and how they look and function. We learned about how we can target various parts of the bacteria with various types of antibiotics. We learned about beta-lactams, a particularly potent antibiotic type found in penicillin that can break down bacterial cell walls, making them go pop. Lastly, we learned that bacteria can evolve to grow resistant to antibiotics, especially if we misuse antibiotics. Right, for today's 2-minute explain, let's talk about brain freeze. Kudos to some random children eating gelato behind me while I was traveling earlier in the year for this topic suggestion. I'm sure you've had the wonderful experience of enjoying a refreshing slushie or licking down an ice cream, when you suddenly get struck with an awful tightness and pain in the back of your head. The phenomenon that we call brain freeze is technically called cold stimulus headache, or sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia. Oh boy, I want to write that on a patient's discharge summary as a diagnosis at some point. My favorite diagnosis title so far is fried rice syndrome, but I digress. Funnily, brain freeze isn't recorded that much in history until ice cream makes an appearance, which is probably why it used to be called an ice cream headache. The word brain freeze was first recorded in 1968 in a Canadian academic journal. Anyway, what causes this horrible sensation, ruining our delightful experience of having a nice icy drink or dessert on a hot summer's day? Believe it or not, for something that seems so silly, we don't exactly know why brain freeze happens. There are some theories though. The leading theory is that the sudden cold in your mouth rapidly cools the palate or the roof of your mouth. You know how when it's cold your fingers go pale and cold? That's because of vasoconstriction, the tightening of your blood vessels to redirect the precious warmth in your blood to your core and vital organs. The same thing happens to the teeny tiny blood vessels or capillaries in your sinuses just above the palate when the cold strikes. But this doesn't last long, and your palate starts warming again from your body heat. This makes the capillaries vasodilate. As the blood vessels shrink and expand in rapid succession, the blood vessel senses the stretching as pain. The pain is sensed by the nerves that go from your face to the brain, and this causes something called referred pain, where the body feels pain not in the place where the painful stimulus is, but along where the nerve runs. This is why sometimes people having heart attacks have arm or shoulder pain, while your appendicitis pain moves from the center to the lower right quadrant of your abdomen, and why being kicked in the testicles makes your stomach sore. This blood vessel stretching pain is actually quite similar to what happens in migraines. So if you've never had migraines, brain freeze gives you a taste of what it's like, minus all the other awful things like light and sound sensitivity and how long it lasts. There's also a theory that it could be that the cold stimulus causes a sudden spike of blood flow to the front of your brain, but researchers aren't 100% certain which is the real cause of brain freeze. One thing is for sure though, eating or drinking something cold quickly drastically increases your risk of having brain freeze, by more than double according to one study. And when you do get it, there's not much you can do other than gently re-warming your palate with your tongue and hoping for the blood vessels to chill out before the gelato melts. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Explain This. I hope you've learned something interesting and maybe even useful today. If you've enjoyed this episode, try listen to some of the old ones on infections like the ones we mentioned before. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Bye for now. Explain This was written and hosted by me, Jin Kim. If you'd like to suggest a topic or just send a lovely message, you can email me at explainthiscast@gmail.com or follow me on Facebook or Twitter